In the early 80s, before Ellis Island was turned into a museum, it was in such dangerous disrepair that the Park Service only allowed a small group of visitors for a guided 1.5-hour tour. A friend went on one of these tours, and she called me saying, "You must go to Ellis Island. Those are your paintings." Her call brought to mind that Ellis Island was the ultimate in sanctuaries, and I had just painted a series of paintings of old churches and missions and synagogues that I called sanctuaries. Well, my goodness, what was Ellis Island if not a sanctuary? I called the Park Service and I asked to speak to the head of the Ellis Island Park. It's part of the Park Service. And I got his permission to stay on the island between tours and be allowed access to many of the rooms and the other buildings also. And this led to a series of paintings of interiors Ellis Island. The main building was perhaps the largest, most elegant building anyone had seen who came from a small town in Europe. It was purposely designed that way to assure immigrants that America was a spectacular place. The first stop was the baggage room, then to the registry room. Lines were formed. The ships had given over their passenger lists. The lists were checked against each person. There's a myth that new names were given. Occasionally, there was a letter or a sound that did not translate into English, but new names were unusual. More common names were anglicized after living here. My maternal grandmother's last name was the exception to the myth. They were given the name Long because when asked by a previous immigrant what my great-grandfather's name was, the immigrant answered, "The Longa," meaning the tall one. And therefore, they had the name Long. While the immigrants were walking up the steps to the examination room, they were being looked at for physical problems. Chalk marks were put on jackets with code, so the doctors in the examination room had information. Eyes were checked for a very contagious eye disease. There was great fear that one would be sent back because of infirmity. 2% were, thus the name Isle of Tears. There was an infirmary where some regained health. 3,000 would-be immigrants died there. The dormer rooms above the registry room were used to house those who were waiting for family or friends to come for them. My former father-in-law had a scary experience of being an 11-year-old boy with his 13-year-old sister and having arrived at Ellis Island without their uncle coming to pick them up. The two siblings were separated, the boy with the men on one side of the dormer and the girl with the women on the other side. They spent a week in the dormers until being taken to a rooming house by a social service society. The people there managed to reach the uncle. He came by train, picked the children up, and took them to Arkansas, where they lived until maturity. While the museum was being restored, I was allowed back to document some more images. I have no idea what this room was originally for, but I was taken with the beautiful red wall. Perhaps it was fireproofing. The next to last stop on an immigrant's journey through Ellis Island were the office area and the cashier's windows, where the former country's money was exchanged for American dollars. For a period of time, there was much corruption at Ellis Island. Immigrants were being sold false citizenship papers. Foreign monies were being shortchanged. Immigrants were being treated very badly. President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in and cleaned it up. Then to the waiting room, where conveyances would take one to either New York City or the train station. On my first visit to Ellis, I went on that small tour. When we got to the waiting room, an elderly man spoke out about his introduction to America. He had a piece of paper in his pocket. It said, Houston. You know, huh? The guard gave him the directions to Houston, Texas. He was actually supposed to go to Houston Street in New York City. He said he made a lot of money in Houston and was happy the mistake was made. Angel Island was the immigration station in San Francisco Bay through which the Chinese immigrated to the United States for better lives. But American laborers resented the Chinese because the latter were willing to work for cheap wages. Americans accused the Chinese of monopolizing jobs. Stiff immigration laws were passed. From 1910 to 1940, Chinese immigrants were detained and interrogated at Ellis Island. U.S. officials hoped to deport as many as possible by asking obscure questions about Chinese villages and family histories that immigrants would have trouble answering correctly. Men and women were housed separately. Detainees spent much of their time in the barracks between interrogations. The immigrants expressed their fears and their frustrations through messages and poems written or carved into the walls. Some poems are still visible at the museum today. Immigrants were detained weeks, months, sometimes even years. This is a far sadder place than Ellis Island.